This lecture will focus on the Caliphate and the Islamic system of governance. In this lecture, we will explore the concept of political Islam and some examples of Islamists, the Quran and the use of the Arabic term for caliphate, which is Khilafah, the caliphate in different historical periods, some arguments for the establishment or the need for a caliphate, particularly in the classical period, and political alternatives to a caliphate in the modern period, as argued by a number of thinkers. And finally, the ISIS and the establishment of its caliphate and the reactions of the Muslims to this so called caliphate. Let us look at political Islam and some examples of Islamist thinkers very briefly. So, what is political Islam? One understanding of political Islam is that it is the belief that Islam should guide social and political as well as personal life. That is of a Muslim. Another is that political Islam is about establishing an Islamic state or an Islamic socio-political order in a predominantly Muslim state or territory. This Islamic state or socio-political order is expected to be based on Islamic law or the Sharia. In a sense, the legal system of this state should be an Islamic one. In a sense, then, political Islam seeks to use Islam to shape the political system of a country. Those Muslims in the modern period who are associated with this idea of political Islam are often referred to in the literature as Islamists. Not all Muslims are Islamists. There are many Muslims who do not see any need for Muslims to establish what is referred to as an Islamic state governed by Islamic law. Many Muslims are quite comfortable in living under a democratic or liberal democratic state. Islamism is a relatively modern phenomenon. It emerged in response to a number of contemporary social and political challenges in the Muslim world. Islamism emerged in the early to mid 20th century and was driven largely by two important organizations. One that emerged in Egypt, that is Muslim Brotherhood, and the other is that emerged in the Indian subcontinent, which is Jamaat Islami. Let me mention briefly some well known Islamist thinkers. First, Hassan al Banna, or Hassan al Banna, died 1949. Hassan al Banna was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. He argued that Muslim countries should be ruled by an Islamic polity, but this should be established gradually and peacefully. So, although he believed in the establishment of an Islamic state in which Sharia laws were implemented, he did not believe this should be achieved through violent uprising or revolution. Instead, it should occur gradually by Islamizing society first. Islamizing means that ideas, values, practices, and systems in the society that are not Islamic or against Islam or anti Islam should be gradually set aside and changed to more Islamically acceptable ones. The Muslim Brotherhood generally followed this gradual approach by creating social organizations such as medical clinics, educational centers, and Islamic schools in Egypt during the 20th century. It sought to provide services to people, which in turn could lead to the Islamization of society gradually. Sayyid Qutb died 1966, also of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, believed in the establishment of a political system based on the Sharia. However, Qutb's approach was different. It was revolutionary. This is quite evident in his writings, which emphasized the importance of overthrowing all systems of governance and replacing them with Sharia based governance, if necessary by force. and this is evident particularly in his later writings. According to Qutb, contemporary societies are in a state of what he calls Jahiliyyah, Jahiliyah. This term was used to describe the Arabian society as being in a state of ignorance before the emergence of Islam. Qutb uses this concept of Jahiliyyah in his writings. For Qutb, Jahiliyyah means rejecting God's sovereignty. When Muslims adopt ideas such as a secular state or secular law, they are, in Qutb's view, rejecting God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty requires that Muslims govern their societies based on God's law, that is, the Sharia. Therefore, Sharia law or Sharia based law should be implemented, including all of its socio political aspects, like personal, civil, and criminal law. Those who reject Sharia as a basis of governance, although they may call themselves Muslim, they are in fact rejecting God's sovereignty, according to Qutb. Another key figure associated with Islamism is Abul A'la Maududi, who started off exploring this idea of Islam and politics in the Indian subcontinent before the creation of Pakistan. When Pakistan was created, he established himself there. Originally, he was a journalist, but a very prolific writer. He wrote on matters such as Islamic State, Islamic Constitution, the relationship between Sharia and politics, and developed a lot of ideas about Islamic State in his writings. He wanted to conceptualize what an Islamic State would look like. According to Maududi, the foundation of political theory in Islam is that no human being can exercise authority over others or legislate for them. Let me quote Maududi. He says, God is not the mere creator of the universe. He is also its ruler and governor. The right of legislation belongs only to God, according to Maududi. In an ideal political system, therefore, laws are not made by people but by God. This means following the Sharia. All these three thinkers that I have referred to were Sunni Muslims. The idea of an Islamic state in the 20th century was developed largely by these Sunni thinkers. Let us now look at a Shia thinker of the 20th century, Ayatollah Khomeini from Iran, who died in 1989. Khomeini argued for the establishment of a state based on religious laws. He argued that governance is a fundamental feature of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad's mission. Therefore, Muslims should establish an Islamic government based on Sharia to administer their political, cultural, and economic affairs. Khomeini then went on to explain the nature and form of an Islamic state and how it should be ruled. According to him, the ruler must have greater knowledge than others of Islamic law. Khomeini argued that the jurists or the fuqaha were therefore the most qualified to rule an Islamic state. Khomeini is presenting a rather Shia perspective, but not many Shia scholars or thinkers agreed with his view of an Islamic state. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when Khomeini took over power in Iran, Islamic laws were gradually introduced and incorporated into the system of law and the constitution. The entire Iranian legal system was Islamized according to Khomeini's ideas. It is not just the legal system, but also political, economic, and financial systems as well. At a social level, women, for example, were expected to wear the hijab in public. Hijab is often understood as what Muslim women wear to cover their hair and neck. Of course, hijab has other meanings. Also, many Islamic civil and criminal laws were implemented as part of the legal system. This emphasis on the Islamization of politics can be observed in the Iranian constitution itself. For example, Article 4 of the Iranian constitution says, and I quote, all civil, penal, financial, economic, administrative, military, and political laws shall be based on Islamic standards. It also confirms in Article 5 that the supreme leader of the country should be a Shia jurist. Pakistan is another country that has been strongly influenced by Islamism. Pakistan is where Maududi was active from the time of the creation of Pakistan. His ideas resonated well with many young Muslims. When General Ziaul Haq took power in Pakistan in July 1977, he shifted the country uh, to a form of Islamic state and Islamicized politics. This was to be done by implementing Islamic teachings and Sharia based laws. Ziaul Haq emphasized the implementation of Islamic laws in certain areas of marriage, criminal law, and blasphemy. This brief overview of the thinking of key Islamist thinkers shows that political Islam is not a monolithic line of thinking. Different figures and political movements have their own approaches to Islamic governance and how to achieve it. But a key idea that is driving modern political Islam or Islamism has historical connections. That idea is the caliphate. So, what is a caliphate? Well, the caliphate traditionally was the institution that Muslims considered to be the most appropriate for the governance of the Muslim community. It included the Muslim community and the lands they conquered. This was originally. Of course, these lands included many non Muslims. To simplify, let's consider the caliphate as an institution or a system for governance of Muslim societies that Muslims adopted from the very beginning of Islam. After the death of the Prophet, Muslims began to consolidate the Muslim state. Gradually, it expanded from Medina to the rest of Arabia and to the Middle East and North Africa. There was a state for Muslims. This state was referred to as a caliphate. You can think of the caliphate as an empire with an Islamic basis. The first caliphate began with the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632. After that, the institution continued in some form until 1924, when it was abolished by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk formally at the fall of the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Caliphate. The word caliphate comes from the Arabic word khilafa, which is about taking the position of others to perform the legal and religious rites on behalf of them. The caliphate was ruled by a caliph, which is the Arabic word for successor. The caliph's role was to provide political and military leadership, although to some degree he also provided religious leadership. In Islam, Prophet Muhammad is known as the seal of the prophets, which means that no one can take his place as the messenger of God. He is the final prophet. However, other Muslims can represent his position as a ruler. Let me quote from the Quran. It says, O you who believe, obey God and obey the messenger and those from among you who are invested with authority. So this Quranic verse is saying that others, that is apart from Prophet Muhammad, can be invested with authority in the community. Today, many Muslims still hold on to the concept and vision of the caliphate, even though it no longer exists. But whether it is something that all Muslims should aspire to, that is to see created or recreated, is a subject of disagreement, and we will explore that later. Does the Quran mention the Arabic word for caliphate or caliph? Let us look at where the notion of a caliphate comes from. The most obvious place to start is the Quran. So, does the Quran speak of a caliphate? Well, the Arabic term Khalifa is used twice in the Quran. Khalifa is caliph. The first verse is chapter 2, verse 30, which says, and let me quote: "Remember when your Lord said to the angels, I am going to place a successive human authority on earth. They asked Allah, O God, will you place in it someone who will spread corruption there and shed blood while we, meaning angels, glorify your praises and proclaim your holiness? Allah, O God, responded, I know what you do not know." This is with reference to the creation of the first human being according to Islamic tradition, Adam. Adam is considered a Khalifa or Caliph, or a kind of representative of God on earth. The translation of the Arabic text here refers to a human successor on earth. In this verse, the Khalifa is God's representative on earth. The second reference is chapter 38, verse 26. This is with reference to David, or Prophet David, according to Islamic tradition. It says, O David, surely we have made you a succeeding messenger on earth. The word used is Khalifa or Caliph. So judge among humankind with the truth and do not ever follow prejudice that it may make you err from the way of Allah. Surely the ones who err from the way of Allah will have a strict torment, for they have forgotten the day of reckoning. Most traditional Muslim scholars have tended to interpret this second verse as referring to political rule. The caliph in this verse, referring to David, is one who judges among humankind or amongst humankind on behalf of God and enacts justice, which sounds very much like a political role. But is this referring to the political institution of the caliphate that developed in the early years of Islamic history? There are differences of opinion on this. Some scholars believe that this verse does not encompass those ideas because the institution of a caliphate was developed later, after this verse was revealed. So, whether the Quran refers to the caliphate as an institution of governance for the Muslim community is not settled for Muslims. Some believe it does, others disagree. In any case, given the differences of opinion surrounding this verse, it seems clear that the Quran does not prescribe a caliphate as the only model of governance for Muslims. Let us now look at what the caliphate was like historically. We can divide Islamic history into different periods, starting with the very first after the death of Prophet Muhammad. So we look at the era of, or the period of, the rightly guided caliphs or Rashidun Caliphs. So the first era of the caliphate was the period of the rightly guided or Rashidun Caliphs, which started upon the Prophet's death and ended in 661. There were four Rashidun Caliphs: Abu Bakr, who ruled from 632 for only 2 years, Omar, who ruled from 634 for 10 years, Osman, who ruled from 644 for 12 years, and Ali, who ruled from 656 until 661. Medina, in modern day Saudi Arabia, was the capital of the Muslim state or the caliphate then. These first four caliphs were men who had lived closely with the Prophet Muhammad and knew the Prophet and his message extremely well. Each of these caliphs came to rule the community through a slightly different process. Abu Bakr was chosen by the early Muslim community after heated debates in Medina, and he was not the only representative put forward for the role. Omar, the second caliph, was nominated by Abu Bakr as his successor when Abu Bakr was on his deathbed. So unlike the situation when the Prophet died, there was a clear successor ready to take office after Abu Bakr. When Omar was killed, Uthman, the third caliph, was elected by a council of electors, which Omar nominated. Ali, the fourth caliph, stepped into the office when Usman too was killed. Ali was also killed. As you can see, only one of the four caliphs, that is the first one, died a natural death. The others were all killed by someone in the community. These men had all been companions of the Prophet and ruled by virtue of their personal connections to him. The first four caliphs are remembered by many Muslims as the Rashidun or rightly guided caliphs. They are considered rightly guided because their rule reflected the ideals and goals of Prophet Muhammad. However, no clear process for choosing a ruler emerged from their appointments. Each came to office by a different method. There was simply no clear guidance on this matter, either in the teachings of the Quran or in the Prophet's practice. The rule of the Rashidun Caliphs marked a time of great expansion of the Islamic Caliphate. Muslim victories in modern-day Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, Iran, and Iraq, among others, brought enormous wealth and power to the Caliphate. Let us now look at the Umayyad Caliphate. So after the Rashidun Caliphs, the next period of the Caliphate occurred, or the next era of the Caliphate occurred under the rule of the Umayyads. It spanned from 661 to 750. Umayyads were Muslims from Mecca, from the tribe of Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet. The capital of the Umayyads was not Medina, but Damascus in Syria. The first Umayyad ruler or caliph is Muawiyah, who was an opponent of Ali, the fourth caliph. As you can see, the Umayyads came to power as a result of internal conflict among Muslims. Muawiyah was a highly skilled politician, and he used the conflict to maximum advantage for him. The Caliphate of Muawiyah marks the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate. In this era of the Caliphate, leadership was passed on within the Umayyad family or on the basis of hereditary rule. This is something new for Muslims. It was a period marked by growing divisions in the Muslim world, including a civil war among different groups that raged for many years. However, the Umayyads were also successful militarily. The Caliphate expanded into new territory, including North Africa and Spain, and absorbed more groups into the Caliphate. It was during their rule that Muslims took over the Iberian Peninsula or Spain. This caliphate lasted approximately 90 years. Years of internal conflict and civil war was brought to an end by another dynasty, again originally from Mecca. This dynasty is referred to as the Abbasids. The Abbasid Caliphate, which, like the Umayyad Caliphate, was also dynastic in nature. Let us look at the Abbasid Caliphate very briefly. The Abbasid period began in 750 and ended with the Mongol invasion of Baghdad in 1258. It is considered a glorious time in the history of Islam, a golden era of knowledge creation, scientific developments, and material progress. A key development during the Abbasid period was the establishment of Baghdad as the new capital of the Caliphate. Baghdad was the center of Abbasid power, and it was centrally located, easily accessible. It was an important place for trade and the exchange of ideas. A love of knowledge was evident in Baghdad. Scholars, philosophers, doctors, and other thinkers all gathered to share ideas. The Abbasid period was a time of scientific discovery. It was during this period that Abbasid rulers based in Baghdad initiated a major movement for translating Greek, Persian, and Indian scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic. The rulers also created libraries and institutions of learning. This translation project or movement led to the proliferation of scientific works in Arabic including in medicine, physics, chemistry, engineering, and mathematics, as well as philosophy. When you study the history of science, you will come across names of many Muslim scientists and thinkers and philosophers. A lot of this was happening during the Abbasid period. This knowledge production, of course, was not restricted to Baghdad and other major cities nearby. Other cities of the Muslim world, including the Spanish cities like Cordoba under Muslim rulers, were also very active in this project of knowledge creation. Baghdad, however, was far from many territories under the Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphs tried to hold the Caliphate together, but they found it difficult to control the many diverse groups and communities within the state. Rebellions occurred regularly, and the Caliphate had trouble collecting taxes in many areas. In both Africa and Spain, opponents proclaimed new competing caliphates. The Abbasids managed to hold power and even reclaim some of their influence in remote areas of the Caliphate, but they were unable to resist the power of the Mongol forces. The Mongol forces began to conquer vast territories in Asia and later in Europe and the Middle East, eventually leading to Baghdad. They captured Baghdad in 1258. The Ottoman Empire or the Caliphate was the last Sunni Islamic Caliphate. It was established in the 14th century and ended in the 20th century with the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1924. The key point to note is that for much of Muslim history, there were many Muslim states, often competing with each other or calling their states caliphates. So it is not unusual to see several caliphates functioning in different parts of the world at the same time. They had different practices, different ways of governing, different ways of managing the appointment of the ruler. It is not necessarily the person who is labeled as caliph who is the actual ruler in all these situations. It could be just the generals who are the actual rulers in a particular caliphate, and the caliph is left only with a symbolic authority. So the situation varied enormously from period to period. So, this brief overview of caliphates in Muslim history perhaps would tell us that there was no one single conception of what the caliphate is. Muslims needed to govern themselves, and in different contexts and circumstances, different forms of governance were practiced. But today, among certain sections of the Muslim communities, there is a view that the caliphate is the Islamic institution of governance. And somehow it is an Islamic requirement that Muslims should set up a caliphate to govern themselves. The idea is closely associated with modern political Islam, which we looked at earlier in the lecture. Let us look at the differences among Muslims on the nature of caliphate and why there is a need for that. As this historical overview shows, the caliphate took different forms in different periods, and the caliphs came to power in different ways. With this in mind, it should be no surprise that there is no shared understanding of what a caliphate is or if it should be resurrected today. From the very beginning, these questions about political affairs of Muslims caused great division among Muslims. There are many points of view about the nature and scope of caliphal authority and the criteria for appointment of a caliph. This has always been the case. As we spoke about several lectures ago, there was major disagreement about who should go on to lead the Muslim community after the Prophet died, because he did not name a successor, at least according to Sunni beliefs. Some of the Muslims believed Abu Bakr was the best candidate for caliph due to his seniority, being the most respected companion of the Prophet, at least as many Muslims see that. While others claimed Ali was the most suitable candidate because he was the closest relative of the Prophet. As we know, Abu Bakr was chosen as the first caliph, and Ali eventually became the fourth ruler of the early Muslim community. Because of the political conditions in the Arabian Peninsula, the first four caliphs were all from among the Quraysh tribe, which was the dominant tribe in Mecca and the tribe from which Prophet Muhammad came. So, in a sense, the authority of the caliphs was also connected to the authority of the Prophet to some extent. Later in the political history of Islam, caliphs were chosen outside of the Quraysh tribe quite often. However, not all Muslims believed that was the right decision. They believed that the ruler of the Muslim community should only come from the line of the Quraysh. After all, that was the precedent set by the first four caliphs. At least this is how many Sunni Muslims see this issue. Prophet Muhammad himself also came from that tribe. Again, this is an issue that has caused disagreement among Muslims. Now let us look at some of the classical Muslim views about the caliphate. I'm presenting the views of a number of scholars from the classical period. So for the first scholar, establishing a caliphate is an obligation on Muslims. It is crucial for the protection of the religion of Islam, and many Islamic obligations simply cannot be fulfilled without a caliph, or without a caliph, or without a caliphate. The second scholar says that the religion requires a just ruler. The caliph is the guardian of the religion. Here again, protection of religion becomes important. Without the protection of the caliph, there would be chaos in the community, as this scholar sees. The third scholar says Muslims must have an imam or a leader. The imam or the leader implements law, maintains hudud. These are the various prescribed punishments in the Quran. And the imam guards frontiers, the borders, equips armies, receives zakat, and subjugates the rebels. The fourth scholar says the office of governing the people is one of the greatest obligations of the religion. Without it, he says, we cannot secure the good of this life or the next. There are, of course, many other views on what the nature of the caliphate is and why Muslims need that. There's a lot of focus on governance, order, protection of the religion, implementation of law, and the like. From the classical period to the modern period. So, what are the debates among Muslims on caliphate today like? Today, when Muslims talk about a caliphate and whether it should be re-established, there are different ideas of what this could mean. After all, it is almost 100 years after the abolishment of the last caliphate, that is the Ottoman Caliphate. And the political situation around the world has changed dramatically since then. For some Muslims, the caliphate consists of a single Muslim state where Sharia law is applied. This understanding of caliphate comes from its inception in early Islamic history. For other Muslims, the caliphate is a pan-Islamic polity made up of a host of smaller states. This understanding of a caliphate is more conceptual in nature. Muslims live separately, but they are governed by an overarching political power. For yet other Muslims, the notion of a caliphate is more of an ideal based around the unity of all Muslims, where the bonds of faith override any other tribal, ethnic, linguistic, or civic identity. Their vision is similar to the notion of the ummah, or the community. It is a sense of community across different geographical places, not a group of Muslims all living in the same place under a physically present ruler. So today there are different notions of what a caliphate should be and how it should be established. So let us look at the alternatives to a caliphate and a couple of examples from modern Muslim thinkers. We'll look at Fazlur Rahman first. Fazlur Rahman is a very well-known modern Muslim thinker. He was originally from Pakistan and lived the last 20 years or so of his life in the US as an academic and written extensively on Islamic issues. He says, the goal of an Islamic society is to create cooperation, brotherhood, and a feeling of self-sacrifice in its members. He says that this can only happen when all members of society have been provided with socio-economic justice and are free from all exploitation, spiritual, economic, and social exploitation. He goes on to say that an Islamic institution of governance should establish equality of all human beings, social justice, and eradication of exploitation. He doesn't talk about a caliphate, he's talking about governance. The second scholar we are looking at is Khalid Abul Fadl. Khalid Abul Fadl is a very well known Muslim thinker, again based in the US. He says that democracy is the best option for promoting justice and protecting human dignity today. Because of characteristics like equal rights for speech, association, and the right to vote, democracy offers a system of authority with accountability for human beings. It says that this principle of democracy is consistent with the Islamic principle of justice. He also says that God does not seek to regulate all human affairs, and that God leaves human beings considerable latitude to regulate their own affairs within certain moral guidelines. Views of Fazl Rahman and Khalid Abul Fadl appear to be very attractive to a very large number of Muslims. So these figures are not talking about establishing a caliphate, they're talking about governance, justice, fairness, and the like. Let us now look at the ISIS and the establishment of a caliphate. ISIS is the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, was a group that emerged around 2010 in Iraq. It was originally a branch of Al-Qaeda called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by a person whose name is Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who was killed in 2006. Between 2004 and 2006, Zarqawi aspired to declare the establishment of an Islamic state. One key feature of ISIS is the establishment of what they call a caliphate. After Zarqawi's death in 2006, his successor declared the Islamic State of Iraq. This signaled ambitions to revive the caliphate. The Islamic State of Iraq gradually created a black flag with the words, "No God but God, Muhammad the Messenger of God." It is really an emblem of its self-proclaimed state. Islamic State of Iraq expanded into Syria in 2013 when Syria had entered the civil war, and this led to rebranding Islamic State of Iraq to Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, proclaimed the formation of a caliphate on the 29th of June 2014. Al-Baghdadi proclaimed himself Amir al-Mu'mineen, which means commander of the faithful, which is traditionally the caliph's traditional title in Islamic history, Amir al-Mu'mineen, or the commander of the faithful. He also claimed to be from the Prophet's own tribe, Quraysh, which is often considered an important criterion for someone to be a legitimate caliph among Sunni Muslims. ISIS called upon all Muslims around the world to give al-Baghdadi the oath of allegiance, or in Arabic, bay'ah, oath of allegiance as the caliph, and try to migrate to ISIS-controlled territories. The caliphate established by ISIS was defined both as a place and identity, and sought to reunite Muslims under a supranational Islamic government. The notion of caliphate adopted by the ISIS sharply contradicts with the notion of nation states today. The ISIS refused to identify borders. Its spokesman said in 2014 that, I quote, "Our goal is to establish an Islamic state that doesn't recognize borders." In June 2014, al-Baghdadi made his public appearance, delivering a sermon from a mosque in the recently captured city of Mosul in Iraq. In that sermon, he declared a caliphate stretching from Aleppo in Syria to Diyala in Iraq. He named himself its caliph. How did he justify taking up the position of caliph? Interestingly, in his speech, he claimed to have come from the same tribe as Prophet Muhammad. Question is, why is that important? You might remember I said earlier that many Sunni Muslims believe a caliph must come from the tribe of the Quraysh. So by naming himself a descendant of that tribe and descendant of the Prophet indirectly, in a sense, he is strengthening the authority of his claim in the eyes of those Muslims who hold that view. Another interesting observation is that he quoted the first Caliph Abu Bakr in his speech. He basically used the same speech used by Abu Bakr in 632. In Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's speech, he said, I was appointed as a leader for you, although I am not the best of you, nor am I better than you. Therefore, if you see me upon truth, then aid me. And if you see me upon falsehood, then advise me. Obey me as long as I obey Allah in your regards. This is exactly what Abu Bakr said in 632. So al-Baghdadi is claiming authority by directly referencing the first caliph who was chosen to lead the early Muslim community, saying that he too had been appointed as a leader. So what was the reaction of the Muslim community to his speech? I mean Muslim communities around the world. As we know, al-Baghdadi's claims were taken seriously by some Muslims. His speeches drew Muslims to his territory in parts of Iraq and Syria from around the world. And these people were enticed by this vision of a caliphate where Islamic law was implemented. And one of the things al-Baghdadi tried to do was to implement a form of Sharia law in the territories ISIS occupied. He enforced many of the traditional laws to do with the governance of religious minorities and the implementation of the hudud punishments, or punishments for consumption of wine, adultery, and theft, for example, which I made reference to in some earlier lectures. However, there were many more Muslims who spoke out against him and who challenged the legitimacy of his caliphate. One of the most notable examples is an open letter to al-Baghdadi that was endorsed by many high-profile Muslim leaders and scholars from around the world. Some of its signatories include current and former Grand Muftis of Egypt and chairperson of the Indonesian Council of Ulama, the head of Supreme Council for Fatwa and Islamic Affairs in Nigeria, and many other well-regarded Muslim leaders, scholars, and academics from around the world. The letter to al-Baghdadi challenges al-Baghdadi's authority to establish a caliphate. Here are some quotes. It's a very long letter. Very briefly, I'll mention these couple of quotes. It says, the letter says, a new caliphate requires consensus from Muslims and not just from those in some small corner of the world. Then it goes on to say, who gave you authority over the Ummah, the community, Muslim community? Was it your group? If this is the case, then a group of no more than several thousand has appointed itself the ruler of over 1.5 billion Muslims. So, in terms of final reflections, today there is no caliphate, and there is disagreement among Muslims about whether one should be established. Some Muslims believe the caliphate is a sacred religious institution. It is something Muslims should work towards and is universal and necessary for all Muslims to live within one. Other Muslims see the caliphate as a political institution that can meet the needs of Muslims. Since the Quran does not prescribe a particular model for governance and only offers some political principles, such as the need for consultation in managing the affairs of the community, the caliphate is one among many models that may serve this purpose. Other Muslims believe that caliphate is not an institution prescribed by Islam. It was a historical reality, but not one that Muslims should aspire to today. There is no need for such an institution today, they would argue. In reality, there are very few Muslims actively working to create a caliphate today, and there is no unified effort to resurrect it that is shared by all Muslims or the vast majority of Muslims. Some Muslims glorify the caliphate, others condemn it, or consider it unnecessary, and others reinterpret it for particular political or religious purposes. For some Muslims, the caliphate remains an ideal. They have a vision of an Islamic polity where Muslims will be united and all their aspirations as a community will be fulfilled. They look back in Islamic history to times when the Muslims were politically and militarily strong, and they believe the institution of the caliphate will help them re-establish that status. Even if the notion of a caliphate was a shared ideal, it would be very difficult to establish it today. In the era of nation states, especially after many Muslim majority states have become independent after the colonial rule, and taken into account the diversity that exists among Muslims today, it would be challenging to bring such diverse interests, positions, and realities together under one single political body. There are 56 to 57 Muslim majority countries around the world in which probably two-thirds of Muslims live. Equally important is the fact that one-third of Muslims live in non-Muslim majority countries such as India. Just this diversity in the number of Muslims scattered all over the world make it perhaps obvious that bringing all Muslims or the vast majority of Muslims under one political umbrella is an extremely challenging task, to say the least. The question is, what do you think? So, in summary, the notion of a caliphate has a long history among Muslims. It was a historical institution that was established just after the Prophet's death. Since then, it has taken a variety of different forms. Among Muslims today, there are still debates about whether a caliphate should be re-established, and if so, what form it should take. However, there is strong agreement among Muslim scholars that the caliphate established by the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, was not a legitimate one. Thanks for watching. We hope this deepened your understanding of Islam. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Keep exploring. Don't forget to subscribe.